This guide is split into two separate videos, a bare-bones, too-long didn't-read summary for those that just want the raw build information and gameplay footage, and this standard build guide featuring more in-depth explanations about gear choice, playstyle, and leveling. Links to the TLDR version, leveling trees, and path of building paste bins for the mapping setup, lab setup, and low-budget setups are provided in the description below. In Path of Exile, many builds are general purpose, meant for doing a wide variety of content well, but not excelling at any one thing. Other builds are highly specialized, geared towards doing very specific content in the most optimized way possible, but sacrificing the ability to do other content very well, or even at all. One of the most popular specialized builds is a Magic Find map farmer, which loads up on gear that increases item quantity and races through maps to generate as much loot as possible in the shortest amount of time. There is, however, a lesser-known cousin of Magic Find builds, which is meant to quickly farm content where item quantity gear does not have a large impact on the rewards, such as the Labyrinth. Today, we're going to talk about this build archetype, the Roadrunner. First, a disclaimer. Do not make this build if you want to push high-tier maps or kill in-game bosses. This is not the focus of the build, and it does these things very poorly. This build does three things extremely well and to the exclusion of most others. It is a top-tier lab runner, a fantastic low-level incursion farmer, and it is great for shepherding and spreading Elder influence to speed farm yellow-tier Elder for those with a large pool of maps to throw away. This build can also be a pain to level if you don't have some currency for leveling gear, so I would not recommend this build as a league starter unless you know what you're getting into. Now that we have that out of the way, welcome to the Oriath Academy Guide for the Roadrunner. There are several types of Roadrunners, including melee versions, Blade Vortex variations, and Spellmine Izaro phase skippers that all aim at completing the labyrinth as quickly as possible, typically using a Pathfinder, but after the Ascendancy rework and the addition of the Might of the Meek unique jewel, the Ascendant could very well be a new contender for top roadrunning builds, but this is a discussion better left for another time. This guide is going to detail a Pathfinder melee variation using Molten Strike and Frost Blades. Let's start with the Ascendancy and Passive Tree. We are using the Pathfinder Ascendancy for two main reasons. The first is the Nature's Boon Pathfinder node, which grants Flask charges over time without the need to kill enemies, meaning that we can blaze through the lab without needing to fight and refill our flasks. The second is that Pathfinder also gains a lot of movement speed from boosting the effect of flasks and the Ascendancy node Nature's Adrenaline. The passive tree is focused around grabbing notables that increase movement speed and ones that impact our flasks, such as reducing the amount of charges we use, increasing the duration and potency of flasks, and giving us more charges, which actually scales up the flask charges over time that we gain from Nature's Boon. Our pathing on the tree also grabs nearby life and mana nodes, the Mind Over Matter and Elemental Overload keystones, a handful of jewel sockets, and the Elemental Attack Penetration notables in the Ranger area. Before going into gear, let's take a second real quick to talk about Mind Over Matter and why it is so powerful on lab running builds. In the Labyrinth, traps deal damage based on a percentage of your health. However, this does not take into account the secondary health pool of mana when using Mind Over Matter. If a player with 10,000 life were to take half their life in damage from a trap, it would be 5,000 damage. A Mind Over Matter player with 7,000 life and 3,000 mana would have the same effective life pool of 10,000, but half of their life would only be 3,500 damage. This means that a properly balanced Mind Over Matter build takes roughly a third less damage from traps in the lab. The gear we use is aimed at maximizing movement speed in every gear slot possible and has a slightly modified setup depending on the content it is doing at the time. For all content, we use a Devoto's Devotion helmet, as it is a 20% movement speed pair of boots you can put on your head. My choice of enchant here was Phase Run Duration for lab, but an enchantment for Frostblades or Molten Strike also works, though no enchant is necessary for the build. All of them are simple quality of life boosts. Queen of the Forest is a conditional 75% movement speed pair of boots you can wear on your body, and Karui Ward or Karui Charge is a 10% movement speed pair of boots you can wear around your neck. On a higher budget, you can get a corrupted version with another 8 to 10% movement speed as the implicit. For boots on your feet, the fastest option is 7 League Step, but I recommend instead using Dance of the Offered, as they are vastly cheaper and give this build near permanent onslaught for an additional 20% movement, attack, and cast speed on top of the base 25% movement speed, some mana, and some lightning resist. Beware of using these boots too early though, as they aren't sustainable before you have decent mana regeneration to deal with the downside. Boots can also be corrupted for additional movement speed, so keep your eyes out for those if you have the budget. The rest of the gear is split into 2 sets, one for incursions and maps, and the other for speedrunning lab. For running maps, we use a pair of Dreamfeather swords as they grant a ton of damage scaled from our evasion, a Gluttony belt for Calling Strike and Poacher's Mark on hit, which helps to recover life and mana, rare rings to cap our resistances as well as give us life and mana, and a pair of Thunderfist gloves as a budget 5-link for Molten Strike or for Frostblades. If coloring the gem sockets is a pain, one can find fairly cheap corrupted Thunderfists with all white sockets thanks to the Corruption Altar in Incursion Temples. For running lab, we swap our belt to a String of Servitude, granting 36% movement speed while using flasks. You can swap your belt while Azaro is entering the arena into a Darkness Enthroned belt with a pair of Abyss Jewels focused on damage or life depending on how the build feels for you at the time. We also have the option of swapping out Thunderfists for rare gloves, as we no longer need to run Frostblades during lab runs. And you can swap out a ring for a ring with Poacher's or Warlord's Mark on hip to help with recovery against Azaro. We also run 2 sets of weapons for lab. A set of Griffin Axes, as they are 10% movement speed boosts we hold in our hands, and a pair of Grellwood Shanks we use against Azaro for point blank, extra Molten Strike projectiles, and most importantly to gain Iron Reflexes while stationary, converting our approximately 50,000 evasion into 50,000 armor, allowing us to easily face tank Azaro without much worry. Grellwood Shank is the reason this build does not run acrobatics, as that keystone reduces our armor and makes us less tanky against Azaro. Make sure not to use Gluttony and Grellwood Shank at the same time, or you will get yourself killed as you lose all your armor and evasion while stationary due to their interactions. I recommend also getting one or both Grellwood Shanks corrupted to grant Fortify on hit, as attaching Fortify to a movement skill means we temporarily lose our armor and become a little more vulnerable to Azaro. Though I haven't experienced too much risk from Azaro as long as you are capable of panic mashing your flasks to constantly keep them up. Speaking of which, let's talk about the most important part of any Pathfinder build, the flasks. The first flask is a Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline. While an Alchemist prefix on the flask would grant us a bit more movement speed, it drains the flask very quickly, which means that you'll need to stop and kill enemies occasionally for flask charges, causing it to be less effective for lab running, unless it's a fast layout or you have a lot of practice running that day's lab. If you do, you should run Alchemist. But even then, I've found that using Experimenter's prefix on the Quicksilver has a much better feel to it, which is why I recommend that for this build instead. Our second and third flasks are a Jade and a Stibnite flask, both with the Experimenter's prefix and one having a Reflexes suffix and the other having a Warding suffix. I recommend getting Warding on your Stibnite flask, as it stores more uses and functionally provides permanent curse immunity with this setup. Our final 2 flasks are dependent on how comfortable you are with the build. If you are new to the playstyle, I recommend a Seething or Bubbling Divine Life Flask of Staunching, paired with either Lavianga's Spirit or a Bubbling Sanctified Mana Flask of Iron Skin or of Curing. Once you are comfortable with the build, I recommend a Seething or Bubbling Hallowed Hybrid Flask of Staunching, paired with that series Promise. Due to the mechanics of this flask with converted physical damage, coupled with the boosted flask power of Pathfinder, and this passive tree, it provides an incredible amount of damage to the build. Now that we've covered flasks, let's take a look at the jewels and skill gem setups for the build. The 2 most important jewels for this build are the Wildfire Jewels, which we put in the 2 sockets by Scion, helping to scale Molten Strike into large amounts of damage with little investment. The rest of our jewel sockets we fill with Abyss Jewels, prioritizing life, mana, and added elemental damage to attacks or to attacks with swords. For our skill gems, we run Molten Strike linked to Multi-Strike, Concentrated Effect, added cold damage, and if you have a 5 or a 6 link, we had elemental damage with attacks and added lightning damage. These colors are hard to get on Queen of the Forest though, so I recommend using the 4-link setup in Thunderfist if you can't get proper colors, though this build does just fine on a 4 or 5-link. I actually sold my 6-link because it was absolutely overkill for this build, and I'd rather use that currency on a different character. For Frost Blades, I recommend Multi-Strike, Ancestral Call, and elemental damage with attacks if you're using Thunderfist, or added cold damage if you're using Rare Gloves. We also run a 4-link phase run setup linked to increased duration, faster casting, and enhance. This means that we have boots even on our skill bar, boots everywhere. The rest of the gem sockets for the build are flexible and up to preference, but here's some of the gems I've found most useful for the build. Charged Dash for crossing gaps in lab, linked to Fortify if you need the survivability boost versus Azaro and don't have a corrupted Grellwood Shank, though the armor from Grellwood is typically more than enough. Ancestral Protector for the boost to attack speed, though a 4-link or a 3-link totem setup can also be used to boost single target damage output. I use Blood Rage for mapping, but not in the lab. A Golem, depending on your preference. Most of them are useful in some capacity, though I would recommend starting with a Chaos or a Stone Golem to help with lab running, and switching to a Lightning Golem for more damage later on. Clarity can be used to boost mana regen, though it isn't necessary. Herald of Ice can be a nice boost to clear speed while mapping, but I prefer keeping less mana reserved for lab running. Cast when damage taken, Immortal Call, increased duration can be useful as well, though most of the time you either evade too much or have so much armor that it isn't as useful as it is on other builds. If you aren't running a Curse on Hit Ring or Gluttony, another useful setup is Cast when damage taken, Blade Vortex, Curse on Hit with Warlord's Mark or Poacher's Mark for additional recovery. Finally, let's talk about the Pantheon choices and how to level this build. Pantheon choices are honestly completely up to preference. I prefer to run Brine King as my major on the off chance I get stunned, and Ralakesh for immunity to blind and maim, but a good argument is to be made for Lunaris, especially early on in the build as it adds some physical mitigation and even more movement speed. Pair this with the Tukohama Minor for physical reduction while stationary. Since you also have about 50k armor while stationary, Azaro is going to have a very hard time killing you as long as you resist the urge to run around too much. Think of lab running with this build as a game of red light, green light. For those with some currency, I recommend leveling with a pair of 7 League Step boots, several Quicksilver flasks, and a Thief's Torment or a ring corrupted with level 21 Wrath for once you hit your 30s. Poet's Pen wands using Frenzy, faster attacks, Pierce, and lesser multiple projectiles into greater multiple projectiles later on. Add life gain on hit and or onslaught if you can afford the mana cost. You can use spell setups of your choice in the pens, though the most popular version I would recommend is running Unearth with lesser multiple or greater multiple projectiles in the second socket and Culling Strike or Body Swap in the third socket, alongside Volatile Dead with concentrated effect, controlled destruction, and or elemental focus in the other pen. For those starting without much currency, I would recommend leveling right into Frost Blades and Molten Strike. You will need to either buy Molten Strike from another player or obtain it on a different character if you want it in Act 1. You can get one quickly by getting a Marauder, Duelist, Templar, or Scion to the starting town as your first quest reward. It is worth noting, Molten Strike gets much more powerful with the Wildfire Jewels, and so I recommend purchasing them and targeting the 2 jewel sockets in the middle of the tree as soon as possible to ramp up Molten Strike damage. For leveling melee, you can use your choice of weapon. Just try and upgrade your weapons fairly often or your damage will fall behind. Another good option is to level using Sunder with a Mace or an Axe, though this gem will need to be purchased from another player if you wish to level this way. I recommend waiting to use Dance of the Offered until after you get Mind Over Matter and the mana nodes behind it, which is usually when the build can handle the degen from the boots, especially if you're running the Clarity aura. For the Bandit reward, we kill all 3 for the extra passive points, though Kraton can be a competitive option to switch to after level 90, and Alira is also a good temporary option while leveling for resists and the ability to run Dance of the Offered a little bit sooner. At lower levels, when survivability can be an issue, I recommend ignoring the movement speed nodes on the passive tree and instead grabbing more life nodes near the Scion area until you can safely face tank Azaro, at which point you can swap those nodes back to the movement speed nodes on the tree. Thank you for watching this Oriath Academy guide on wearing boots everywhere you can. Class dismissed.